were given. A couple of years ago in our parish pastoral council, we said that two things will sustain us as we move forward as a parish community into the future. One is spirituality, not just saying prayers, but being very concerned about our prayer lives. And the other was adult education, and that's where this falls in. And we are basing ourselves on the Pope's letter, Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. And tonight Joe Boland is going to give us a great overview. I was going to say something funny about Joe agreeing with the Pope, or the Pope agreeing with Joe. So and there's always a first, but second not to say that. Anyway,
I said it to him first.
Who needs to introduce Joe Boland? He's been here 24 years. He was here for 24 years as parish priest, and it's great to have you back again.
Thank you, Martin. Martin said I was going to give you an overview, which is partly true, but really what I'm being asked to do is an introduction. When Sharon sent the email and gave us 5 topics, I was attracted by the first topic, and I think I got my application in first, and so I got this title, The New Evangelisation and the Challenges of Today's World. That appealed to me very much, that. But when I sat down to actually do something about it, I discovered that really a lot of that doesn't belong to me tonight. I've been given the first section to look at. It's only half a dozen pages, and it's a kind of overview, but it's mainly an introduction, laying down some of the one or two very, very basic principles that lie behind the whole idea of the new evangelisation. And so that's all really I can do. There's a whole load of things in this tonight and in the whole document that I'd love to get my teeth into, but somebody else is going to have to do that at the other meetings. So that's tonight's topic, the new evangelisation and the challenges of today's world. Will I get to now? Yeah. Just a little bit of historical background to this idea. Obviously evangelisation has been around for 2,000 years. I mean, Jesus says, go out and teach all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, and so on. But during his many years as Pope, Pope Paul II, Pope Paul VI is the first important person in this story, apart from the Second Vatican Council itself, which has the whole notion of evangelisation, reaching out to the world at the heart of it. But in the 1960s, Pope Paul VI, who was beatified, of course, recently, and who I think, apart from the present Pope, would be my personal favourite of the ones that I've known. Unfortunately, he's mostly remembered for the Humanae Vitae and the whole contraception issue, but Pope Paul VI had a tremendous contribution to make to the life of the Church, apart from the fact that he took on the Second Vatican Council and brought it to a conclusion. But he wrote in the 60s a document which they say with a very similar name called Evangelii, and it lays out the most wonderful vision of what it means to evangelise the world. And the things that Pope Paul VI says in Evangelii are fundamentally the same things that Pope Francis says in his document, with a little bit of a change. During his years, Pope John Paul II, as I started to say earlier, spoke often about the idea of the new evangelisation, but he never pinned down what it meant. And it was his successor, Pope Benedict, who established on the 21st of September 2014 a pontifical council to look at this issue. Does that date mean anything to you?
No.
2109-14. The Feast of St. Matthew, the 21st of September, right? So he set up the Pontifical Council for promoting the new evangelisation. And he put in charge of it a man called Archbishop Fisichella. He famously said that he had an office, he had a desk, and there was nothing on it, and he had no computer. So that it was as vague as that. He said at the very beginning that the project would take at least 150 years. And it's one of these things that would never stop. So it's not like a year of faith or a year of evangelization or a fortnight of anything. You know, we're talking here about something truly historical, something that none of us will ever see the end of. Some of us are lucky to see the beginning of it. And so it's a massive undertaking. So you can imagine him with his desk, piece of paper on it, a blank paper, no computer. Where do we go here? And one of the things he did was he set up a thing called Mission Metropolis, which held meetings all over the world. Had you ever heard of any of them? No, because neither had I. And I don't think many people have. You know, it was obviously, he felt he had to do something, so he did what most people do, but when he feel the need to do something, he had a meeting. And he had a number of them in cities all over the world, but I don't think it made much of an impression. The only other thing that happened was that his department in 2013 was given responsibility for the catechism of the church, but that doesn't change the world either. So we're dealing here with something in its infancy, something in its beginning. And one of the things that he says, and we're going to be looking at very basic statements like this tonight, so that hopefully by the end we'll understand what the whole essence of this project is. And he said that only through people who are touched by God can God return to humanity. There's no program that can do it. There's no book that can do it. It can only be done by people who know God themselves, communicating with others who long to know God. So it's done one person at a time, really. It's done all the 24 hours every day by the way people live. So it's not a program. You can't buy a book and read about it. It's something much more profound than that we're talking about. Sorry, I've still jumped right to the very end. Is this computer? Must be a cheap computer, is it? So we come to, having established that, the previous popes, Pope Benedict setting up this pontifical group organisation, and then Archbishop Fisichella. We come to Pope Francis himself and to Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. And the key word is the joy. That's Francis's complete and utter commitment. That the answer, the key to it all, is joy. I want to expose you at times to the actual text, and these are the opening lines of the document. The joy of the gospel fills the hearts and the lives of all who encounter Jesus. Those who accept his offer of salvation are set free from sin, sorrow, inner emptiness and loneliness. With Christ, joy is constantly born anew. In this exhortation, I wish to encourage the Christian faithful to embark upon a new chapter of evangelization marked by this joy, while pointing out new paths for the Church's journey in the years to come. New paths is all he can point out, but joy is at the centre of it. And just one or two little phrases taken from the document at the beginning, where he talks about joy. An evangelizer must never look like someone who's come back from a funeral. He was quoted as that at the time. Let us recover and deepen our enthusiasm. May the world be enabled to receive the good news, not from evangelizers who are dejected, discouraged, impatient, or anxious, but from ministers of the gospel whose lives glow with fervour who have first received the joy of Christ. Until that happens, re-evangelisation is a non-starter. And I want to pause at that particular slide for me, Pilot, and ask you to think about it. Maybe we could have a little bit of chat about it. I mean, how much enthusiasm do you think there is around in the Catholic community? Are we a joyful people, or are we dejected, discouraged, impatient, or anxious? If somebody came to any church in this diocese on any Sunday, would they experience enthusiasm, do you think? What do you think? Yeah, it varies. On the whole, what do you think? For some, yeah. Would there be enough to set the world on fire, do you think?
Well, it gives people a nice joyful glow, I think. Coming to the church and the singing and the welcoming, I think it could do.
Is there any, I mean, I'm just asking the question, but is there any sign that people are so impressed by our enthusiasm and our joy that they're all wanting to find out about God? Is there any evidence of this?
I haven't seen a queue around the building yet.
Sorry?
I haven't seen a queue around
No,
the
they're
building
not.
yet.
No. And people talk about young folk. I've no doubt at all that the problem is, and I've said this for years and years and years, and most of the things I'm going to say, most of you have heard for years and years and years. But young people are not the problem. If we were a deeply enthusiastic people, if instead of being dejected and discouraged, as we sometimes get about the state of the world and the state of the church and fewer folk going to Mass and having to close down parishes and all that kind of stuff, if we could move beyond all that stuff and be joyful people, I think young people would be attracted by that. But there's not much about the church that attracts them. That would be true, wouldn't it? There's not much that's attracting them. And so until we discover this joy and move beyond those other feelings, which are real, in Ignatian terms, those would be desolations, which would be pulling us down. Dejection, discouragement, impatience, anxiety. And I think there's a lot of that around in the church. As long as that's the case, and as long as we allow those feelings to guide us, then we'll never re-evangelise anything. So it's that whole thing about enthusiasm and joy. Then it talks about faith, and the Pope says, "I invite all Christians everywhere to a renewed personal encounter with Jesus Christ. No one should think that this invitation is not meant for him or her, since no one is excluded from the joy brought by the Lord." Do you think an average Catholic believes that? Do you think an average Catholic knows what a personal encounter with Christ is? Do you yourself know what a personal encounter with Christ is? I mean, have you met the risen Jesus? Or is it just something you've heard about? Something you've read about in a book? Because again, we have the heart of the matter here. Because we will only experience the joy that the Pope speaks of if we have had a personal encounter with Jesus. If we know, if Jesus is a real person for us. And don't worry if he's not, because for 20 odd years as a priest, I used to wonder what that meant. You know, people said, you're supposed to love Jesus, and I thought, I love Jesus if I'm mad. You know? It's a real problem for men. You know, what loving Jesus meant. I didn't know what it was. I kept reading these books about Jesus was your friend, but I mean, I didn't experience Jesus as my friend in that sense. And I suspect that's pretty common. And then gradually, slowly but surely, as the year passed, that begins to change. And your relationship with Jesus deepens. As most of you know, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius were a key moment in that whole experience for me. That's 25 plus years ago. But once again, to understand tonight, the other issues will come in the other chapters. But unless we're at least desiring a personal relationship with Jesus, and to desire it actually is already happening. Unless Jesus becomes real, unless God becomes real, unless you can begin to see the world as filled with God, you're not going to have the joy that the Pope speaks of. Is that clearly true, is it? Would you say? Yeah. So we're talking about very basic things here. And we're not talking about that kind of charismatic waving your arms about joy. We're singing gospel hymns and all that kind of stuff. It's not about that. For some people that might be part of it. But it's a much more interior thing. And it comes through prayer, it comes through reflection, it comes through wanting it. It comes through wanting it, basically. I keep using these phrases, but again, we've got joy, we've got a personal relationship with Jesus, and the Pope expresses it in another way here, which I picked out. Being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, the death and resurrection, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. So, to meet the risen Jesus, to have a personal relationship with Jesus, to have an intimate relationship with the Father, is to begin to see the world in an entirely new way. And again, the Pope says, the Gospel offers us the chance to live life on a higher plane, but with no less intensity. It's a different way of living, it's a different way of seeing the world, it's a different way of thinking. And it's not possible unless we have a personal relationship at the heart of it. Thanks to this encounter, the Pope says, we are liberated from our narrowness and our self-absorption. And again, it is not by proselytizing, going out and converting folk, that the church grows, but by attraction. One of the things St. Ignatius teaches us is that when you go out into the world, you don't talk to them about God. You know what it's like when you go down the street and somebody's shouting at you about God, you're just trying to kind of give them away. But you don't want to, it's not real, that. St. Ignatius advises us to go out into the world and talk to people about the things that interest them. Spiritual conversation. Talk to them about what's going on in their lives. And if the opportunity arises, and they bring up the subject of God, then talk about it. But you don't start with that. You start with their ordinary lives, with whatever's going on in their lives. And hopefully, if you're a person of joy, not waving your arms about, a person where they can sense joy, and where they can sense there's something about you that they want to know about, then that's the beginning of evangelization. Does that make sense? Are you convinced by that?
Yes.
So it's not by proselytizing, but by attraction. I was saying to the people on Sunday that, because the gospel the readings were suitable to this, that the evangelization is not about getting people to say their prayers. It's not about getting people to come to Mass. It's not about filling the churches again. It's not about those kind of things. It's not about converting them to the church. It's not about making folk into Catholics. It's not about that. It's about transforming the world It's about transforming society. And if we're really good at it, then some of them might want to become Catholics and want to be part of the church, but that's not what it's about. We're not trying to make townsfolk into Catholics. We're trying to transform the world. And that's why Archbishop Evangelii says we're talking about 150 to 200 years. But there is evidence that it's vital, because maybe every generation thinks this, but there are a number of crises that we're facing at the moment. I mean, the whole business of the environment, the whole question of hunger and poverty and violence. Would it be too much to say that we're at a point in our development as a human race where if things don't change over the next 100 to 200 years, we could destroy ourselves? That's true, isn't it? And that's what evangelisation is about. It's about transforming the way we live. So you don't do that in a year. You don't do that in a week's retreat or something. Now the Pope says something very important about himself and about the Church. I do not believe, he says, that the papal magisterium should be expected to offer a definitive word on every question. And that is hugely important. Because one of the things he also said in relation to that is he has told bishops that they have to start thinking for themselves as well. They have to start exercising proper ministry in their own diocese. Because for years, as you know, there was a movement after the Second Vatican Council towards collegiality and so on, but very, very gradually, the Roman Curia has drawn all that back to itself. And it's causing this very destructive act in the Church. And Pope Francis has said, you know that famous story, all the stories that came out about him, he was speaking to a few people from Latin America, and he's reported to have told them whatever they were doing. He said, you'll maybe get a letter from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, but just ignore it, he said. And he has encouraged bishops to exercise responsibility in their own diocese. And he's encouraging us as well to take on the job of discerning this whole business of re-evangelisation. He can't sit in Rome and know what all the issues are in every part of the world. He doesn't have the solutions to them. He's encouraging the whole Church to take responsibility for them, to reflect on local issues, and to work out the way forward. So the whole Church is involved in this. So once again, the spirit of the Second Vatican Council is coming back to the fore again. He does say in the first few pages that we're looking at, he says that there are a whole load of issues and he can't speak about them all. But he does identify a few things at this point which he's going to comment on later in the document. And they are the reform of the Church and her missionary outreach. I think that's the next talk, is it? But as far as I remember. It's a church that's got to stop looking inwards all the time, discussing whether we have Mass on this day or that day, and turn out to the world. The temptation faced by pastoral workers. You get the impression here he's digging, as he often does, at the situation in Rome. People who are looking for titles and big jobs and bishoprics and all that worldly stuff. He wants us to get rid of all that nonsense. He'll talk about the Church as the entire people of God which evangelises. He attaches tremendous importance to the Sunday holiday, because that is the weekly way in which we are fed and nourished by the Word, not just the homily, but the readings on which the homily is supposed to be based. And he actually tells priests a little bit about how to prepare a homily, at least it's his idea of how to do it, but he attaches great importance to that. The inclusion of the poor in society. I mean, one of the differences between Pope Francis and Pope Benedict was that they both talked about re-evangelisation, but really Pope John Paul and Pope Benedict had a different notion of evangelization from Pope Francis, in the sense that they, and Pope Benedict in particular, were completely Euro-centred. Their vision of the world was Europe, especially Pope Benedict. It was always going on about European culture and how Europe, its Christian culture. And one of the ways in which it manifested itself, you remember, was when we began to talk about Turkey becoming a member of the European Union. He wrote a document against it. Turkey, he said, was not part of Europe, it was Islamic. So he had this vision of re-evangelizing Europe, and you got the impression sometimes that what he meant, and what Pope John Paul to some extent meant, was restoring Europe to its previous Christian state. You know, when the church, if you go back far enough, the church and the state were synonymous, they were the same thing. So the church had huge dominance in Europe. And it's almost as if they would like to go back to that. But Pope Francis comes from Argentina. So he's not Euro-centred. He comes from a South American background, and so his view of the world is much wider, you know, and that's had a huge influence. And then, of course, peace and dialogue within society, the spiritual motivation of ministry. Won't go into all those because you'll come across those in the rest of the document. And that's what you're going to be looking at over the coming weeks. Next week you have the Church's missionary transformation, the proclamation of the gospel, the social dimension of evangelization, and spirit-filled evangelizers. I hope you enjoy those when they come. He addresses the question of who is evangelization for in these opening pages. And he talks first of all about people like yourselves, the faithful who regularly take part in community worship and gather on the Lord's Day to be nourished by the Word and the Eucharist. But he adds, and this is very important, that includes people of faith who rarely take part in worship. Now that's a very interesting notion. Pope Francis sees people who rarely take part in worship as very much members of the church, and he includes them along with the people who do go to church every Sunday. These are people of faith as well, and of course there are thousands of them around us today who, for a whole variety of reasons, have become disillusioned with the church, and they're dejected and all the stuff that the Pope talked about earlier. But for Pope Francis, those people are members of the church, and we have to really start thinking that way. Then he says the baptized who lack a meaningful relationship with the church. That's those who have just completely given up on the church. And the third is those who do not know Jesus Christ. In other words, the whole world. So essentially, it's for churchgoers, for the Pope who have lost touch with the church, and for those who don't know Jesus Christ. And I don't think there's anybody in the world that doesn't fall into one of those categories. So I mean, we're talking here about everybody. I'm jumping in a little bit into the next person's territory here, but he says a number of no's very clearly, and this gives an idea. This will give us an idea of what's coming. Again, we're talking about a man here who's lived all his life in Latin America. He's a man who had his own problems with liberty theology and so on, but has very much grown over the years. And his own admission has made lots of mistakes, but has learned from it, which makes him such a good pope, I think. But there are a whole series of things that he sees evangelization as being utterly opposed to, in the sense that if we want to transform the world, these are the things we have to reform. And of course, we're moving in here to political areas. I was telling Danny, I talked about some of this stuff, as I say, at the weekend, and one or two people have been writing on the website. They're not very happy about it. Sounds a bit socialistic, you know. And of course, the Pope has been accused by right-wing Christians and others in America of being a Marxist because he says these things. But this is what evangelization is about. It's about standing up to an economy of exclusion. An economy of exclusion is fundamentally an economy where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and there are people who have no place in the economy. One of the Labour Party's called them seems to me, is that there is no longer really a working class. There's a middle class and an underclass. The working class used to be the Labour Party's kind of world, but they're struggling now, as many of us are, because that world has changed, and we have an underclass. We have people who have no role in society. And the Pope says, that's not acceptable. No to the idolatry, the new idolatry of money. I mean, you've heard me saying this for years. The law of the marketplace. We worship the goddess money, and our commandments rule us. The laws of the marketplace cannot be challenged, or you're excommunicated. And we sacrifice people every day on our altar. The Pope says that is not acceptable. And as Christians we have to challenge it, and that's what transforming the world means. No to a financial system that rules rather than serves. Pope John Paul said that very powerfully in one of his encyclicals, in a very simple way. He said, economics exists to serve people. People don't exist to serve economics. And you just have to look at the way our country is run to see that it's economic theories that rule us. People are forced to fit into it, regardless of the consequences for them. No to the inequality that spawns violence. Why is there so much violence around the world? Because of inequality. Look at the whole business of these refugees in the Mediterranean. I was saying to Daniel, there was a letter in the Guardian the other day which suggested that if the way to solve the problem was just to let them drown, why don't we just go out and sink the boats and that would be quicker, that would solve the problem more quickly. I used to say to you here, if there was no food in New Farm and there was food in Short Leys, where would you all go? Looking at New Farm. And that's what's happening in the world. The way to keep people in their own country is not to put up barriers and keep them out. It's to solve the problems in their own country, and then they won't want to come. They don't want to come here. They prefer to stay at home. And the way to stop them coming is to do something about their situation at home. No to the inequality that spawns violence, the Pope says. No to selfishness and spiritual sloth. No to sterile pessimism. There is so much of that in the church itself. Sometimes when you go to a meeting of priests, what's it like, Martin, sometimes?
Very joyous. Filled with the joy of
I've
the
been
gospel.
at priest meetings where the only way I can describe them is graceless. Graceless and godless, because they were so pessimistic of everything. No to that, the Pope says. And no to spiritual worldliness. I read earlier the opening paragraph. This is the second paragraph. And see if you think this is true. The fundamental problem, the great danger in today's world, pervaded as it is by consumerism, is the desolation and anguish born of a complacent yet covetous heart, the feverish pursuit of frivolous pleasures, and a blunted conscience. Whenever our interior life becomes caught up in its own interests and concerns, there is no longer room for others, no place for the poor. Is he right in saying that? And we've got to not make the mistake of making we're the poor, because we're the rich. And I'm so aware of that myself. There are so many things going on around the world, and you hear them in the news, you just don't have room for them all. And so they kind of float over your head. I can't cope with them all at the same time. And so all these horrific things go on. 300 folk die in a boat in the Mediterranean, and you just move on to the next item in the news. And of course, that's understandable, but it's because of the culture that we live in. It deadens our capacity to feel for people like that. There's so much emphasis on what the Pope says are frivolous, superficial things. And so we can't engage with all that. It's just too much for us. And the Pope says if we're going to transform society, that has to change. And it will change how? By a personal relationship with God, which transforms the way we see the world. The fundamental solution, of course, we've seen it already, is that people who know Jesus personally, are people filled with Christian joy, and are people filled with a missionary spirit. Could you imagine a world like that? What a difference it would make. No wonder Archbishop Evangelii says that we're talking at least 150 years. I mean, this is enormous. But as I think we agreed earlier, it's either that or disaster awaits us around the corner. The Church's role, the Pope says, it is not the task of the Pope to offer a detailed and complete analysis of contemporary reality. But I do exhort all the communities to an ever-watchful scrutiny of the signs of the times. That's a quote from Pope Paul VI. He's in First Encyclical, Ecclesiam Sua. He's calling on us to discern what's going on around us, because he can't do it. And so the question which faces us at this point is this. I'm hoping we can talk about it the way we want. What are the issues facing us here in this country, in this town, in this parish? Sorry, in this Parsa parish. Sorry for that. I managed to get through it so far without noticing any mistakes. What are the issues here in Newfoundland, in Kilmarnock, in Scotland? If we're going to transform society through a joyful faith rooted in a personal relationship with Jesus, what are the issues facing us? So what are they?
A lot of us need is spiritual support. I think it's very difficult for us to live a spiritual life on our own and then just come to Mass on a Sunday and perhaps we do some activity during the week, ministers are ordering, dismiss it to fall or whatever. I think we need a partner, we need a spiritual partner or a spiritual group for support to help us for our growth, to discern our prayer. I mean, not just...
Absolutely. And the parish is the place where that's supposed to happen.
Yes.
Yeah. So Mary said that we need spiritual support. If we just rush out and try to do something about the issues, then we're no different from politicians, It has to be underpinned by something much deeper. And that's a slow process. But there are many of you here who know over a period of years that can happen. How does it happen though? Just looking back in your own experience.
Well, I think for me, divine mercy is the first step to everything.
For you that has been...
The absolute first step to everything that can change your whole outlook and how you regard other people around you. It can transform your whole vision.
Other people will have been transformed in other ways. So would anybody be able to identify how it happens?
Through prayer.
Sorry, who's...
It's me
Oh,
again.
just you again.
It's through
Sorry.
prayer and reflection, and I'm lucky I've got lots of time to do that. Very fortunate.
Prayer and reflection are certainly important. So spiritual support. To be nourished, you need to have your faith nourished, don't you? It needs to be fed. And of course part of it, Martin mentioned at the beginning, part of it is undoubtedly education in faith as well, although that's not the whole story. Education in itself is only a part of it. It's the personal relationship which is key to the whole thing. Any other kind of issues?
Try to get young people to come into the church. I mean, how do we go about? I think your opening word, joy, is a thing which needs to be forward to young people.
Yeah, I suggested that earlier. If young people saw us as a joyful, committed, attractive people, we'd have no problem getting them into the church. Although getting people into the church isn't the primary purpose of evangelisation, but one would hope that once people are evangelised, they might see some point in coming to the church. Anything else?
How do you fathers see us becoming more attractive and attracting young people into the church?
Well, as Martin said at the beginning, I can only agree with the Pope really. When he talks about joy and enthusiasm, but you can't artificially create joy and enthusiasm. It has to be real, and again, as the Pope says, it has to come from a personal relationship with God. That's where the joy and enthusiasm comes from, and people find that attractive. Jerry?
To participate in the church, after prayer and reflection, to participate in the parish and to participate in the church and to see where God is leading you personally.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and one would hope, I mean, that's what the parish is supposed to provide. It's supposed to be a place where people are supported and encouraged. The one thing I'd say about participating in the parish, some people will always do that more than others, because again, it's like the whole thing about evangelisation. The purpose of the parish is not to get people involved in the parish, it's to get people involved in the world. The purpose of the parish is to be a place where you're fed and nourished by the Word and the Eucharist, where you can find people who provide spiritual support for you. But getting involved in the parish is not an end in itself. The world's where we're pointing to. But involvement in the parish can prepare you for that. Yeah. Yeah. But everybody can't be involved in the parish to the same extent. That would be true, wouldn't it? Just age and lifestyle and personality and so on, it has an effect on that.
Perhaps the parishes should have more strings to its bow as far as social issues and things are concerned.
More options, provide. I'm sure that's true, Maureen. But I think it's also important to say that we shouldn't expect the Catholic Church to provide us with all these options, because there are many organisations in society which are already doing things. You know, and one of my kind of things that I've become much more aware of since I went to West Kilmarnock, I've always seen it, but I've become more aware of it now, is how, for perfectly understandable historical reasons, the Catholic community doesn't pull its weight in society in Scotland. I think we still keep our heads down. And we're still living a wee bit out of the past. I think we have to become much more involved in other organisations out beyond the church. Because we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are people out there doing things, and we can work through them. Does that suit you? Understand what I mean?
I think we can in the workplaces as well, but I think my experience is unless you're having that support from your community, it's quite difficult.
Yes.
You know, you can feel like a fish out of water and the danger is there to put your head down and maybe not speak up.
Yes. There's a girl, well, she's a woman with 3 names, but she's younger than me, so she's a girl. She's in West Kilmarnock, and over the last year or so, well, she only came to the parish about 18 months ago, but she's just come alive in terms of her faith. You know, she's discovering things that she never dreamt of before. God's been very, very good to her. But one of the things she loves is to be with people whom she can talk to about these things. And sometimes it's difficult to find folk with that in the Catholic Church, you know. You look at it as if you're daft, you know. God, taking off that too seriously. Danny?
I was going to say that we've really become part of the establishment. We're decent, law-abiding citizens. I read in a book recently that you can't be a Christian unless the police are looking for you. And there's something to be said for that. If you go back to, could you go back to that slide where he says no?
Aye.
You know, no. No to the bedroom tax. No to nuclear weapons. No to poverty. You know, no to standing down and putting a foot in the poor. That's what he's saying.
That's what he's saying.
And that's what we should be saying. Where was a bus from this parish to go in the bedroom tax march? When was the last time we sat down outside Faz Lane? Where are we with these real social issues? We're not really there. You know? And
That's
you know,
what he's brought us that from
yes,
his, from
very
his
much so.
American experience.
And as you say, evangelisation is about the world, it's not about the church.
Yeah.
You know, and we worry about this church that nobody comes to and with no priests, and that seems to be the focus of our lives. We're
it's
looking in the way all the
It's
time.
actually irrelevant because the Pope talks about the need to be hope-filled people as well. And the fact of the matter is that the church is in God's hands. You know, we don't need to worry about the church. The fact that, you know, in 1830 there was one priest in the whole of Ayrshire and Dumfries and Galloway. One priest, Thompson his name was, and he lived at St Margaret's in Ayr.
They came from your kick.
I would expect his new there are so many things in the church, I've said this before, there are so many things in the church today that we think have always been there. There's whole chunks of the church as we grew up, that we grew up with, which are no older, as I keep saying, no older than the 19th century. The church has been in states before in the past that we wouldn't even recognise. We wouldn't know we're in the same church. Things change all the time, and we're going through a time of change, and we don't need to worry about the church. What we need to worry about is the world. You understand what I mean? The church will stumble its way through history the same as it always has. You know, changes that are required will come when they have to come. You know, when there's no other option. At the end of the day, I always think that change never really comes until finance starts to impact, and then people change. But you know, that's not the fundamental issue. If we can focus on God and on reaching out to the world, the church will look after itself. And I wrote down myself, just very quickly, a list of things that I wondered what you would come up with yourself. I wrote those down as local issues. How do you feel about them? Would they be important? I mean, it's only an arbitrary list. I think this is a very important little notes at the end. One of the reasons why people turn against the church is that we so often give the impression that we're against things. You know, if some scientist comes up with a new idea, the church is always against it. You know, we're always against things. And that creates a very negative image. People of faith are for things. People of faith have something good and attractive to offer to the world. We're not against things, we're for things. You know, and we need to develop that kind of mentality of being for things. Oh, would you pick out any of there that were particularly important as far as you're concerned?
Oh yes, care of the elderly.
I'm getting more interested in that myself.
That's an easy one. Take it to Switzerland.
That was not on the list. I didn't. Any others that you would pick out? Yeah.
It's like to be addicted to anything.
Yes.
Grudge to deviate from the line.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right, Alan. Addictions come in all shapes and forms. It's probably true to say that to some extent we're all addicted to something. And to the extent that we're addicted, our freedom is diminished. You know, and that's what's so serious about addiction of any kind, that it diminishes our freedom and we become less human as a result of it. I remember trying to do spiritual exercises in the prison with a guy who was a notorious criminal in Scotland. And I got on very well with him, and we started the exercises, and there was a genuine desire in him to do it. But we had to stop, because it became perfectly clear to me he was so addicted to heroin that he had no capacity to move out of the place he was in. The heroin had totally controlled him. And of course he was in the jail with easy access to it, despite everything we think. Any others?
Isn't that kind of contradiction? Danny and I say that we've become part of society and all the rest of it, but I don't know if the Catholic Church or the members of the Catholic Church have become adult enough or confident enough to start addressing these issues in
Yes.
some cases.
That's what I mean when I said that we've kept our heads down, we've not really pulled our weight in society. And that is, I'm sure it's partly connected with a history of discrimination and so on. But as the Pope said when he was here in 1981, those days have passed. You know, and we need to put them behind us. Like this week in our bulletin in West Kilmarnock, the Rotary Club approached me to see if I'd be willing to just make people aware of them, of their existence, because they do a lot of good things as well. Okay, they're middle-class businessmen, but they're children of God as well. And I was very, very happy to do it. So there was a thing in the bulletin about it this week. I don't know whether anybody will respond, but there is not a single Catholic in the Rotary, that particular Rotary. And it's not that they're excluding Catholics. They may have done it one time. I don't know about that. But they're certainly not excluding them now. There's no women either, although they're not excluding women. You know, women are well. We had one woman that came, but I think just being the only woman there, she gave up. But we need to engage with the rest of society.
Are we then the guilty of xenophobia? Is that part of our culture, our psyche as well? We only like folk that are the same as us, and we only mix with folk that are the same as us. We don't really like.
Technically xenophobia, and that xenophobia is about foreigners, but certainly that fear of people different from ourselves.
I thought xenophobia was different. Or homophobia then, is that different?
Xenophobia from the Greek is foreigners. You know,
Right, I see. Well, foreigners, Protestants and folk like that. You know, we do like to be with our own folk.
Yeah,
you know,
and a number of times we say things like, so-and-so, not a Catholic, but... You know,
but it's all right.
or some obscure person, some referee, he's a Catholic, you know. How in God's name do we know? You know, but I mean, it's understandable from the past, but we need to get away from that stuff, don't we? Would you agree?
So we need to identify first where we are in this kind of 50-year span. Are we in the first decade? We're moving anyway into was it or not?
I don't know what the rest of you think. Jerry's question is, where are we in this 150-year span?
The first hour.
The beginning?
The first hour.
We're right at the start. I mean, I think the things that Pope Francis has talked about ever since his election is such a revolution in the church that we've not seen since Vatican II.
Yeah.
You know, we were kind of drifting back in a lot of things, and he's, you know, pulled the pin out of the grenade, and we're right up in the air. So I think the 150 years, I think, of what he's envisioning is a totally different direction from what we've been drifting in for the last decade.
And yet one of the reaction to Pope Francis shows you that something else has been at work, because as soon as he started to say things, there was a huge sigh of relief from many people in the church, you know, who'd been waiting to hear this. I was joking with Martin, but it's great to hear the Pope's agreeing with things you've been saying for 30 years, you know. He said last week, for example...
Joe, just one point, he did get a lot of opposition.
Oh, of course he's got lots of opposition.
He had his meeting, you know, a couple of months ago, and he didn't get the result he was looking for.
I think he probably got the result he was expecting.
That's different.
But it's, I mean, that is part of a process. I don't think he's unhappy about the result, because that was a preliminary meeting. We've got a year now to talk about it, and we'll see what happens in a year's time. If those things had been passed now instead of say next year, I think it would have caused a split of some kind.
The second point I'd like to make is that, you know, we're all talking about that Catholics are not involved in this, and business, and rosary and all this and that. And we've just come back from England, and you don't have that.
No, England.
So why is it?
I've never lived in England because it's got a different history from Scotland.
It's not the whole of Scotland.
No, it's not even the whole of Scotland. That's
Because
true.
I come from here, I didn't know I was different until I went to North.
There's absolutely no doubt. That's absolutely right. You can't talk about Scotland in general terms. The west of Scotland, where the Irish immigrants came to. If you go to the northeast of Scotland, where I spent a few years teaching in Blair's, that's where you have native Scottish Catholicism in the northeast. It's not Irish at all. And one of the things that when Bernard Aspinall spoke to us in here a number of years ago, he pointed out one of the things that there was tremendous opposition to the Irish when they came. You know, the Irish church and the Scottish church, they just did not get on. There were great fights went on, which is one of the reasons why there was never an Irish bishop in Scotland. The only one who ever became a bishop who was born in Ireland was Cardinal O'Brien. He came to Scotland when he was 5 years old, so I mean so there are historical factors at work in all that. That's certainly true.
Embracing change as well, because there are people that just, I mean, nobody really likes change, and there are some people that just don't want it.
And you're saying with the priest there, not all the priests are on the same page.
Absolutely.
So that's a big problem, I think.
Yes. Yeah, but it's unrealistic to expect all the priests to be on the same page, just as it's unrealistic to expect all of you to be on the same page. We're all very different from each other. I mean, Mark Chambers and I are not on the same page.
We're not in the same chapter.
Francis also was talking about you're raised by young people. He's very attractive for young people because he's so fresh and he's so spontaneous, and he has stayed so much true to himself, you know, living simply. And I think the whole social justice side of the church is something that young people really respond to. They have an incredibly developed sense of social justice. And so when we are out there, you know, at Make Poverty History, or you were saying the bedroom tax marches, that's actually what attracts young people to the church. And, you know, so doing more of what you were saying, being out in the world, is actually something that would allow us to attract our young people.
Yes.
Move your head.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
But having said that, I think many of us here would remember being young ourselves, and when all that's attractive, but something happens to us as we get older, whatever it is, you know. Would that be true?
Joe,
Archie.
can I just say, and Tom Pope said it earlier, the bit about getting rid of pessimism. When I come on a Sunday, I see all sorts of wonderful things in this church. Young people, lots of young people, and children as well, clearly being brought up, you know, in religion, if you like, sometimes faith as well. But looking in the whole, around everything that St. Joseph's does, St. Matthew's, the primary school, St. Andrews, and all of it, when you look around and read and listen, there's enough of lot not to be pessimistic.
Absolutely.
In this area.
But you have to advise to see it, Archie, don't you?
Yes. Well, that's as you get old, perhaps. You can't even like that, get around as much, but I can listen.
Joe, I was, one of the things that we were talking about today at another gathering was about people who are imprisoned. I mean, so we started talking about, oh, what can we do for the prison and all that stuff, and then we began to realise that actually there are so many people in our communities who are imprisoned, and I was drawn to the word despair. The amount of people that we meet through some of the projects like the food bank or the homeless lunch, who are just despairing in life and just don't know when the next thing is, or people who come to church and this is the last port of call. It is something safe for them, you know. So I'm just conscious that, and I don't have any answers. The only thing I can do is sit down and talk to them, and maybe that's all they need, you know. I was just conscious about the despair thing.
There's a huge amount of despair around, which is the opposite of everything that Pope Francis is talking about joy, enthusiasm, personal relationship. I thought we might end by mentioning Jesus. I don't know if we mentioned. And I thought I'd just leave you for a few seconds just to read those two things that Jesus said, just for a couple of minutes, and ponder them. We'll just end by saying together, Our Father,
Hallowed be thy name.
thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thank you very much.
Martin asked me to say thank you to you for coming along this evening. You've done it again. We've turned up here to see about the new evangelisation and the plans that you and the Pope have for changing the world. And again, you've turned it back on ourselves. Let us look at ourselves and our relationship with Christ, our relationship with the church, and our relationship with the world. You've been doing that all your life. So thanks for that as well. Thank you.